The year was 2010. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Isn't this a SNES game? Just trust me, it's fine, you'll get it. The year was 2010, and I was already pretty well versed in the Mario RPG series. I had played at least a couple of each of the currently running Mario RPG series, and as far as I knew, this was as far back as the catalog went. Now, in this particular day, I was doing the same thing I did every other day, searching on YouTube for something to watch. What I came across itself wasn't that important, some random brawl video or something that I'd probably never find again, and I'd never remember it either if it wasn't for the background music. Whatever it was, the melody just sounded so freaking good, but I had no clue what it was from. The only words I could make out were the words Super Mario RPG, and so, like dozens of other songs I had heard on YouTube before it, I typed in whatever I could glean lyrics-wise into the search bar, specifically in this case Super Mario RPG song, and came across a video that would single-handedly change my 7th grade year in ways I couldn't fathom at the time.
Hey, have you heard about that Mario guy? You mean the one with the mushrooms? Yeah, the one jumping around in the forest. Yeah, I know him. Yes? Okay, check it out. Super Mario RPG.
This dated late 2000s song was mesmerizing to me as a kid, and I don't just mean for the melody itself. The lyrics the world painted, the odd creatures and locales, and most importantly, whoever the frick this guy was, made me absolutely obsessed with tracking down whatever the heck this was. And after listening to it for probably what was the 100th time, I was determined to discover whatever Super Mario RPG held. And after finding out what a Super Nintendo was, and then looking at the price, saying nah, and then finding out the Wii already had this game through its online shop service, I ventured out to buy a Wii Points card, hooked up my Wii, put it at the farthest end of my house, connected to somebody else's Wi-Fi that was unguarded because I had no clue how to get our Wi-Fi password, and purchased the long sought after by me specifically Super Mario RPG. And also Paper Mario. Figured, hey, why not play the other Mario RPG I'd never really experienced before? This moment right here would end up being a big deal for a couple of reasons. One, and the lesser of which, being that this was the first time I'd ever went out of my way to play what was, at the time, a retro title. I didn't even know what that term meant at the time. I just knew, hey, wow, this game came out before I was born. Neat. But the other reason, and by far the bigger deal of the two, was that this long string of odd coincidences would lead me to a game that would become the obsession of my entire 7th grade year. I'm not joking. Despite this game coming from a console I had never even heard of at the time, and despite the fact that I had played several of its spiritual successors, this little 16-bit RPG completely enraptured me. I played it for hours when I got home, and then I'd go to school the next day and spend more hours trying to talk about it with anybody who'd listen, which I imagine was probably thrilling for all of my friends who literally did not understand what I was talking about at all. I drew cringy art of it in my notebook, which is thankfully lost forever, so no one will have to see how terrible it probably looked. Heck, this game is the reason why I even met one of my best friends. During one of those oh-so-thrilling Super Mario RPG conversations that my friend Tate was totally interested in, some random dude just decided to jump into the conversation. This guy was apparently a massive fan of Mario, and yet he'd never even heard of the game at all, actually. And just like that, bam, I had made a new friend, actually, one that I still hang out with to this day. And yes, if you're wondering, I did force him to play the game so we could talk about it, but he liked it, so it's all good, right? Yeah, definitely. And for all of that to happen because of a game that was older than I was, you'd have to imagine it was something pretty special, right? It absolutely was. So, as with a lot of the platformers released before it, Super Mario RPG starts with the plot you'd expect it to. Princess Peach, or Toadstool, but I prefer Peach because that's what I grew up with, gets kidnapped by Bowser, and so Mario's gotta go save her again. Surprise, surprise. He arrives at Bowser's castle just kinda hoping to get this over with, and it's here that you'll get your first taste of combat. A lot of the standard RPG rules still apply here. Mario has a certain amount of health, and so do the enemies, and your goal is to get your enemy's health to 0 while taking as little damage as possible. The surprisingly straightforward menu gives you 4 options. The A button lets you do a basic attack, the X button is used for items, the Y button is used for special moves, and the B button allows you to defend or run away. There's obviously a little more to this system than meets the eye, but for now, you clobber all the enemies in the way and reach Bowser. Here you have your climactic final battle with Bowser on this admittedly pretty cool set piece, using the chain behind him to drop him off the chandelier. And boom, the day is saved, princess is rescued. Sweet, let's wrap this up. Mario's a busy guy. Gotta go meet Toad in the Mushroom Kingdom for lunch at 3 and... Yeah, you might want to cancel those lunch plans, Butterino. So you head back to the castle to find this big sword named Exor, who tells you that the castle is now under ownership of the Smithy gang before destroying the bridge, and you know what that means, we get to take the long way around, hooray. And this is where the adventure really begins. I think it's kind of funny how quickly the Bowser kidnaps Peach thing is over and done with. Like even by 96 they had realized that this kind of plot was a little bit overdone. It's also nice to see that they went with a new set of villains this time around. Having Bowser not be the main villain this time not only allows him to serve a role as one of the main protagonists, but it also gives the game a greater sense of scale than it would have had normally. But the Smithy gang, despite, being the main bad guys and all, aren't exactly priority number one here. Getting the princess back is. So time to head to the Mushroom Kingdom and inform the Chancellor that things didn't go exactly as planned. On the way, you head through what is essentially this game's tutorial area, where the basics of the battle system are laid out to you. Or not, if you skip them like I do. But those basics are, or were, really important at the time. You see, when Super Mario RPG was released, RPGs weren't exactly super popular here in the West. Heck, at release, the majority of people picking this up probably had never even heard of the term RPG, much less played one. And so, with the obvious new wave of people that probably play this because the game had Mario on the cover, they needed to design the game to be simple to understand while also injecting a bit of that Mario flavor to make it more interesting for the newcomers to this genre. So yeah, the battle system still contains a lot of the RPG hallmarks I previously mentioned. You have 4 different actions you can do, all of which that have some kind of intended use in battles. Basic attacks are the most common form of damage, able to be used with no cost, but oftentimes not providing the flashy, more powerful benefits of the special attacks. Special attacks, in turn, can be used for a variety of powerful and useful benefits at the cost of using flower points, which are essentially this game's form of mana. You can use items for healing or other properties, killing enemies gives you experience points that can raise your level, raising your level in turn raises your stats, meaning that you gradually get more powerful and can face more and more dangerous challenges. All of that is pretty basic RPG stuff, and if this is all the game had, the battle system would be really boring. And this is where that injection of Mario flavor comes in. This is the introduction of what would later become a hallmark of the Mario RPGs, timed hits. Almost every action in the game has a certain input you can do to greatly increase the power and effectiveness of said action. While doing the basic attacks, for example, pressing the attack button at a certain point in the animation will greatly increase the strength of said attack. Special attacks often have a little bit more complexity to them. They may require you to hold the button down for a specific amount of time, keep a rhythm going to extend the length of the attack, mash the button as quickly as possible to deal the most damage. Almost every action in this game has some kind of input you can do to increase the effectiveness of said action. And this is what makes the battle system tick. As you go through the game, you'll find that these add a variety to the game's combat that a lot of RPGs at the time could never hope to have. It's fairly common in RPGs to end up in a state of autopilot where you just spam the A button to mash through text as quickly as possible just to select the same attack over and over for every battle for hours on end. It can get really stagnating, like no, selecting the same attack over and over is just so stimulating. With this simple addition to combat, however, Super Mario RPG, and really all the Mario RPGs, managed to completely avoid this issue. No matter how basic the enemy is, you have to pay attention. If you want those attacks to really get you anywhere, if you want those special attacks to do any serious damage at all, and if you want to take as little damage as possible, then the timed hits are absolutely crucial. And adding timed hits was honestly kind of a stroke of genius. Remember, a lot of people playing this at the time were probably more used to the more action-packed nature of platformers and fighting games at the time, so adding this bit of interactivity made the battles feel just that bit more enthralling. Now, this is the part of the video where you'd usually expect to hear something along the lines of, I'm not really into RPGs, so these timed hits are the only reason why I can play this kind of game. But like, nah dude, I freaking love RPGs. I've spent many a night getting lost in the stories and worlds of a ton of different RPGs, so yeah, I like RPGs. Now, that being said, as the years have gone on, I've begun to realize that it's a little more complicated than just saying, I like RPGs. The kinds of RPGs I've enjoyed the most have either been ones that have a completely different kind of battle system than this, or if they are turn-based, they need something to stand out besides that, whether it be an interesting world to explore, a gripping narrative, or adding a layer to the battle system that makes it more interesting, because just plain old turn-based battles are not enough for me anymore. And so, needless to say, these timed hits, and really the more flashy combat of the Mario RPGs in general, mean that they don't suffer from the same boring tedium that other RPGs at the time could suffer from. I mean, it also helps that the rest of the game around them is really interesting, but when I actively look forward to the battles as much as the actual story, you did something right. Now, with all of that stuff being said, however, I will admit that returning to this one after having played the rest of the games in this series, it becomes obvious just how simple a lot of these timed hits actually are. The game never really asks you to do anything too intricate, heck, half of them just boil down to pressing a button at the correct time in an attack's animation, and this even goes for the special moves, which you'd kinda expect to be a little more complex, but no, they really aren't. But hey, you know what? I get it. It was the first whack at this kind of system. I get wanting to keep it simple, and that's not even to say I don't have fun with them. Quite the contrary, just like the rest of the series, I still love battling in Super Mario RPG. It's just, when you've played so much of the later entries, it kind of makes this one feel a little simplistic, that's all. So anyways, you make your way through Mushroom Way and inform the Chancellor of the current predicament, with Mario's form of miming the story being absolutely hilarious, and then, without any clue of where to head next, you exit the building to find a random cloud-looking dude chasing after this guy, and he, doesn't succeed. He then begins to cry, which coincidentally makes it start to rain. Talking to him, you'll find out his name is Mallow, and he's a tadpole from the local pond. Oh, okay, I get it, that makes sense. If Sonic Heroes taught me anything, it's that frogs can make it rain, so that makes perfect sense. Apparently, that dude he was chasing around, who's basically this game's version of Popple but a little less cool, stole something from him, and so Mario, being the hero he is, decides to help him out. And boom, we have our second party member. Now, in battle, while Mario is sort of an all-around fighter with decent magic and physical strength, Mallow instead isn't the greatest on physical strength, but is a freaking beast with magic. Not only does he come right out the gate with a pretty solid healing spell, but also a freaking screen nuke as well. Seriously, early game, you can just throw this out and watch as the enemies just magically disappear. In battle, especially this early on, Mallow is an absolute monster, but as an actual character, he's fine, I guess. He has this whole arc about learning to become a stronger person, just like Mario, but honestly, it's just never really done much for me. Like, don't get me wrong, it's cool that he has an actual arc, and that was rather unprecedented at the time, considering it was a Mario game, but I just don't find myself all that interested in said arc. And his bizarre crybaby attitude towards things oftentimes comes off as a little bit too, I don't know, lame. He just seems a little too willing to cry over anything for my liking, but hey, I don't hate him. After Rose Town, he improves dramatically, and besides that, he's fine. He's just not my favorite character. Regardless, you both head out to chase down Croco, and you eventually manage to track him down, beat the tar out of him, and get the item back that he stole. And then you head back to the Mushroom Kingdom to find out that it's been taken over by a bunch of shy guys on pogo sticks. It's, the most intimidating villain I've ever seen. Their leader, Mac, is part of the Smithy gang that previously took over Bowser's Castle. We'll talk more about the Smithy gang later, but for now, all that's important is that Mario and Mallow defeat Mac and manage to get a hold of this little object, one of the 7 star pieces. But shh, Mario doesn't know that yet. Don't spoil the surprise for him. He gets really sad when you do that. And so, with the kingdom saved, Mario and Mallow gotta figure out what to do next. Mallow suggests visiting his grandfather, Frogfucius, since he might have an idea of where to head next. And after a brief run through the sewers that I remember being way more confusing than it actually is, we meet up with Frogfucius, where we learn a couple of important things. 1, Mallow is not actually a tadpole. I'm just shocked. Who could have ever guessed a plot twist like that? 2, Mario's next stop is a place called Rose Town, where some shenanigans are going on, supposedly. And 3, he's attached to this fish line, but he actually has no clothes to hook onto, so where exactly is this hook supposed to be placed? His Rose Way is the next area you head to, which is one of the many platforming-heavy pathways that the game has between major areas, just like Kiro Sewers, Bandit's Pass, and Mushroom Way before it. These areas put the pesky plumber's famous jumping ability to good use, featuring plenty of secrets, puzzles, and isometric platforming that, well, it works. Look, a game like this with this kind of camera angle was always going to be a little janky to design platforming for, but I'd say it works for the most part. The game generally doesn't put you under too much pressure, and punishments are pretty minimal, so it's really not that big of a deal that it's a little awkward. That being said, it's not always like this. Later on, the game tosses some more complex platforming segments at you that really show just how bad the platforming is. Which it is what it is, I guess I'll deal with it if I have to, but if it's optional, I usually choose to skip it. Besides that, however, this approach to environmental design is absolutely a feather in Super Mario RPG's cap, even all these years later. Most RPGs at the time, and even a lot nowadays, failed to make exploration outside of battles all that interesting. Outside of a couple of very basic puzzles, it's not uncommon for these areas to be nothing but random encounter fodder with nothing interesting to see or do. Oh, maybe you can find another potion if you take the left path instead of the right one. Truly captivating. But in Mario RPG's attempt to Mario-ize every element of the game design, they completely mitigate this issue as well. Environments are actually a fun place to be here, not just because there's more variety to the ways you interact with the environment, and not just because the game can present you with more unique challenges and fun mini-games, but also because those pace-interrupting random encounters don't exist here. Every enemy you battle is present in the environment for you to fight as you please. Now, sure, some of the enemies will will barrel at you to try to get you to fight anyways, but that's really all a part of the fun. Feel like battling right now? Then have at it, just run into the enemy and boom, the battle starts. But maybe you've had enough. Well then use your platforming skills to evade the enemies. This way, the game doesn't decide the pace of the game for the player, it's the player decides the pace of the game for themselves. And I know it's common nowadays to have this kind of system, but it wasn't when this game came out. It's only the norm nowadays because games like Mario RPG made it the norm. Now, outside of providing a unique way of presenting encounters, the platforming sections also serve as a good way of breaking up the slower paced aspects of an RPG. Again, a lot of people were probably not used to being railroaded into story sequences and turn-based battles so often, so these serve as a more action-packed segment to keep things interesting. Now, comparing it to later games, they're certainly a little simplistic here, but compared to other RPGs of that era, the environments here are way more interesting to explore. It's actually fun to explore here, and that combined with Mario's lightning-fast movement speed means that the platforming bits retain some of the same joy that comes from the platformers of that era. On to Rose Town. Here we find that the place is under siege by these randomly falling arrows that are freezing people in place. The best are these people wondering where their kid is and he's literally stuck a couple feet from their front door. Aw man, that's rough buddy, and I would help you, but you know, I'm just too tired. I'm gonna go in the inn and sleep in a comfy bed. You have fun outside. Hope it doesn't rain. Inside the inn, however, you find this kid playing with his Mario action figures. And since we really have nothing else important we could be doing, Mario decides to play with the kid. All seems to be going well until he pulls out a different, unique doll, one named Geno, which, well, you know, maybe you should have helped that other kid outside instead, huh? During the night, a small star enters the household, and after examining all of the dolls, rests on the Geno doll before taking it over. And thus, Geno heads out of the house. What he intends to accomplish, no one knows for now. All we do know is that we probably should follow him. Anything to get the heck out of this place. By the time I finally got my hands on this game, the forest maze in specific was one area I was particularly excited to get to. Considering the main reason I found out about this game was entirely built around this song, I wanted to know why this place was so important. And like, as a maze, it kind of leaves something to be desired. Most of it's pretty straightforward and linear, and even the actual maze part of it's pretty basic, but that wasn't the reason I was excited to get here as a kid. The biggest reason is, well, exactly why I kept listening to Rawest Forest so often. The backing track, Beware the Forest Mushrooms, was legendary far before I'd ever even heard of the game, and there's a pretty good reason as to why. The track is mesmerizing and whimsical in ways a Mario track really never was before, featuring a breadth of interlocking melodies that coalesce into this track brimming with atmosphere. Which is funny, that term, atmosphere, was something Mario was quite foreign to at the time. Don't get me wrong, a lot of the music was great in this series, but it was crafted more as video game music than anything else. Something to help support the action on screen instead of helping to support the environment you were actually exploring. It's fun music, but it doesn't add to the world as much as it adds to the feel of the game. In Mario RPG though, the entire game is filled to the brim with tracks that are not only absolute freaking bangers, but also ones that add a sense of atmosphere to the areas they're present in. The Forest Maze track may be the best example of this, and it also has the honor of being my favorite track in the game, but it's far from the only solid track here. Yoko Shimomura was the composer for this game and was given the monumental task of trying to create a soundtrack for a game in a series absolutely full of legendary tracks. And I imagine going into that was probably pretty terrifying for her. And what's so great is that she was able to make a soundtrack that, in my humble opinion, absolutely blows the classic game soundtrack out of the water. She even considered this specific game to be a turning point in her career, and it shows. This would not be the last Mario RPG she would compose for, and there's a very good reason they stuck with her for so long. Now, while the soundtrack was certainly one of the reasons I was so excited to get here as a kid, it wasn't the only one. The other reason by far was this guy right here, Geno. From the moment I first laid eyes on him, there was something about his design that just really clicked with me. It was just such a unique design for a character. I'd never really seen anything like it. Every once in a while, I'll see a character that stands out so much to me personally that I just have to find out what their deal is, and Geno was certainly one of those cases. And our first interaction with the dude happens to be at the end of the forest maze. You see, those arrows that were falling on the town earlier, those were being shot by this guy right over here, Boyer. Before Mario and Malo can jump in and save the day, it's Geno who jumps in. He knocks Boyer back, and when asked who he is, the only detail he divulges is that he serves a higher authority. He's so freaking cool. Mario then arrives, followed by Malo, and this exchange has always freaking cracked me up and I don't know why. Like, come on Mario, he's tried his best, could you have been a little more apologetic? And after a fight with Boyer, who has a pretty cool button disabling gimmick, Geno finally decides to explain what he is. Essentially, he's a servant of the Star Road, where wishes are granted. However, when Exor fell from the sky, he also destroyed the Star Road, meaning that said wishes will never be granted unless the 7 star pieces can be gathered. And thankfully, Mario and the gang were absolutely shocked by this revelation. Thanks for not spoiling it for him, by the way. But despite said shock, Mario and Malo decide to help Geno out, getting us our third party member. Geno is essentially this game's glass cannon. His physical attack stat is by far the highest of all the characters, and the variety of specials he gets are absolutely destructive. He has a high-powered beam attack that can do a ton of damage to one enemy at no cost. He's got a couple of screen nukes that absolutely wreck any enemy in your path, and he's even got an extremely useful stat boosting attack called Geno Boost, which can greatly increase both damage and defense with good timing. Also, you know, he's got a one-hit kill move, so that's pretty great. And while Geno Boost makes him even more of a powerhouse, it's that defense boost that he's gonna need more because Geno cannot take anything. If unblocked, most attacks early on can straight up wipe half of his health out in one go, so you need to make sure you're always paying attention with him. Stick with him though, and you'll find that he may just be the second most useful party member in the game. Now personality-wise, Geno's kind of the straight man of the group, which I think makes a lot of sense here. The other party members are already pretty wacky, and with a set of events as absurd as the ones in Super Mario RPG, having a less wacky character to react to said absurdity just works really well. I think it makes him stand out from the rest of the cast in a good way. With his standout design, standout personality, and extremely fun and interesting moveset, it's no wonder people have been so obsessed with him for so long. But you know what? I want to put a pin on that subject. For now. With the star pieces fully explained, our goals are set. We have to get the 7 star pieces and head to Bowser's Castle and stop the Smithy Gang. Though I do find it rather funny that the actual star pieces themselves are rather incidental, like you're almost just collecting them by accident most of the time. In later games, especially the Paper Mario series, the collectible star object thingamajig is usually the end goal, the thing you're striving to get. Now the path leading up to said star is always super fleshed out and oftentimes can still feature a plot entirely separate from the collectible's influence, but regardless, it's the reason why you're there. In Super Mario RPG, however, half the time you're just kind of getting a star at the end of an area without even being sure there was one there to begin with. The focus is usually on solving the overarching problem affecting an area, not getting the star piece. So, for example, in the next area you find a city full of moles that are all panicking about a couple of kids, Dinah and Mite, nice pun there, being stuck in the mine. So you go into the mine, you have a little run-in with Croco again, fight a member of the Smithy Gang, and you just kind of get a star before going to save Dinah and Mite. Like, sure, the star was nice, but it doesn't really feel like it was the reason why we were here to begin with. Sometimes it feels less like Super Mario RPG Legend of the 7 Stars and more like Super Mario RPG there's some weird stuff going on here, man. Even the game's inciting issue, the whole Bowser's Castle takeover thing, is more of a background element. It's always there, it's always the end goal, but it's always in the background. It's like, oh yes, we gotta go to Bowser's Castle or whatever, but who cares? I gotta chase this weird guy up a hill, wahoo! And you know what? That's fine, because the aforementioned weird stuff that the story focuses on completely makes up for it. Mario RPG is made up of a bunch of smaller little events that I've personally nicknamed micro stories. The name pretty much tells you all you need to know. These are smaller scale narratives that play out over the course of a couple of levels and then conclude quickly before you're shoved onto the next one. They're usually somewhat related to the goal you're trying to accomplish and contain elements that lend themselves to the overarching narrative, but the actual events that take place in these micro stories are oftentimes their own self-contained stories. Now, if you're at all familiar with the later games in this series, you probably already know that these micro stories are fairly common in the Mario RPGs. And you're also probably aware that in what is essentially a hallmark of the Mario RPGs, the actual narratives of these micro stories are usually really freaking weird and completely out of the realm of normal Mario fare. Maybe you've become a professional fighter and are smashing your way to the top while also solving a suspicious mystery. Maybe you're scouring an age-old soda factory for a mysterious soda that may or may not be a little more than soda at this point. Maybe you've been forced to contend with a nerdy lizard dude with some real creepy obsessions in a dating sim section. Whatever it may be, the Mario RPGs have a penchant for crafting utterly bizarre scenarios for the player to go through, and Super Mario RPG is the reason that tradition started in the first place. Right after saving Dinah and Mite, Mario is informed that the princess might just be held captive at a nearby mansion owned by someone named Booster. And so you head to Booster Tower to see if there's any truth to that. I remember my first time getting here, I was kind of blindsided by how this place starts. You go in expecting this menacing tower owned by some evil monster guy, but when you enter, it's just playing this calm hotel lobby music, and these shysters here are less a threatening force and more just there to stop you from bothering Booster while he's busy. Not really as intimidating as I expected. And then you walk up the stairs much more relaxed and... oh. I don't know if I want to be here anymore. And the funny thing is, Booster doesn't really end up being any sort of monster or anything, he's just really weird. He's this dude who was born into wealth and has never really grown up. His behavior is childish and confusing, owed to his lack of communication with the outside world. Pretty much every encounter you have with this guy is hilariously stupid. You spend all this time hiding behind these curtains, trying not to get caught while his friends look for a Mario doll, and then when you get caught, instead of him fighting you, he instead gifts you an item for helping him find the doll. And later when he's taking Peach up the mountain to marry her, he tells Mario he's not invited to the wedding, but he'll still race him to the top for fun. The stakes feel hilariously low because Booster isn't really much of a threat here. You later end up crashing his wedding, and after fighting a, living cake, he then proceeds to eat said living cake before announcing that the wedding was a success and just leaving. I don't think he quite understands what marrying someone means. The wedding is also important because it gave us this scene. This scene would be weirdly prophetic in a horrifying kind of way. And that section is basically indicative of what you can expect going forward. While the areas up to this point kept things safe and more Mario feeling, from this point onward, the different micro stories get much more ambitious and much more strange. It's also this arc where we get our final two party members, and unlike the previous two, which were original characters you'd never seen before, these two party members are probably ones you already know. Bowser had been the main villain for pretty much every major title up to this point, but nothing really presented the character as anything deeper than just being the bad guy. And so I find Bowser's portrayal in this game quite interesting. Here Bowser is presented as more of an egocentric blowhard who's obsessed with keeping up appearances, so much to the point that when he joins you, he tries to play it off like it's you who's joining him. He plays out this tough exterior, but it's pretty clear that losing his castle and all of his forces really hurt him more than he lets on. I think it's a fun way to portray the character, and his exchanges with the other characters makes his interactions really fun. I especially love this moment right here when he's confronted with the reason for his joining. Bowser hesitates to reveal that he's in desperate need of help, and Mallow puts a hand on his shoulder as if to comfort him. After all, they're both essentially putting on a brave face to try and deal with their current problems, and while they both go about it in different ways, this little moment shows that Mallow understands Bowser, probably more than Bowser wants. This take on the character always gelled with me real well, and it must have gelled with others as well, because this personality is the one that would be taken forward and iterated on in later RPGs. And it's a good thing his personality adds a lot to the dynamic of the dialogue, because in battle, Bowser feels notably weaker. In battle, Bowser is assumedly supposed to be a tank with hard-hitting moves and a lot of health to sponge up damage. There are two issues here though. One is that Bowser's defense is kinda whack, meaning his status as a tank doesn't really work out all that well. Issue number two is that he's just not that fun to use, at least for me. His specials aren't really all that fun, and since his stats kinda negate his purpose, it's no wonder I tend to shelve him right away. Peach, funnily enough, is the inverse of Bowser. In battle, Peach is an absolute unit. Her first two specials can completely heal any status effect and basically fully refill the party's health in one go. She's powerful, maybe a bit too powerful. I actually had to limit the amount of times I was allowed to use her healing because I think it can get a little ridiculous if left unchecked. Regardless, in battle, she's a useful, important unit, but as far as her actual character is concerned, well, to give you a good perspective on how bad it is, I think I remember her talking like 2 or 3 times after she joined your party. Yeah, it's that bad. It's unfortunate because later games in the RPG series portray Peach as a much more interesting and fun character than she ever gets here, but what are you gonna do, I guess. 4 out of 5 ain't bad, I just like it if she had a little more to do here, that's all. Squaresoft, the developers of Mario RPG if you didn't know, were given the monumental task of trying to codify the Mario universe into something resembling an actual functional world. Remember, up to this point, Mario's world was just kinda whatever they wanted it to be. Things were put into the world more to improve the gameplay than to build an actual realized place, meaning that up to this point, what the Mushroom Kingdom was, or what any of these characters were meant to be, was left extremely vague. Heck, the Mushroom Kingdom itself, which is ostensibly the place that several of these games took place in, was nothing more than a concept before this game. Super Mario RPG's world is occupied with tons of surreal platforming areas and bizarre worlds, sure, but the many towns and kingdoms between them serve to connect these surreal landscapes to make an actual functional place. Your first taste of this is the Mushroom Kingdom itself, where a massive castle serves as a centerpiece to a bustling town. A detail I've always liked is that several of the NPCs here talk to Mario not as if they know of him, but they actually know him. One of the NPCs excitedly tells Mario that he finally decided to get married, implying that Mario himself is not only friends with the couple, but has also gotten to see their relationship as it was progressing. And I mean, yeah, it seems weird that Mario would just hang out in his house all alone all day. Like, of course he'd have friends, but it's cool to actually see that showcased here. The nice part is that after the Mushroom Kingdom, there's still a bunch of different towns that have their own distinct feel. You get a smaller, less grandiose Toad town, a quaint little town by the sea, and even a couple of towns for non-Toad creatures, including an entire town made up of monsters. It makes the world feel bigger than a bunch of generic Toad towns, and it means that each area has a uniqueness to it that certain later Mario RPGs don't have. And even better is that there's still a solid amount of NPC dialogue to go through, and a decent amount of it is genuinely entertaining. Not all of the jokes land necessarily, but enough of them do to never make it feel tiresome, and regardless, the towns are loaded with NPCs moving and going about their days, which makes the places feel a lot more alive. And that's why when you first arrive in the seaside town, it's clear almost immediately that there's something going wrong here. Unlike past towns which had several NPCs roaming around doing random tasks, there's basically no one outside here at all, and the few NPCs you do find in buildings have something a little bit off about them. They talk and act in a way that feels really unnatural, which makes your first visit to this town really unnerving. Yeah, no, I'm out of here. This place also really sticks out in my mind because of what you're forced to do right after, the sunken pirate ship. This place was probably my least favorite area in the game, and I don't mean the whole dungeon, no, most of it's fine if a little repetitive visually. No, I'm specifically talking about the horrors that lay right behind this door. So I am probably the only person in existence that had such a problem with this area, but there was no place in the game more infamous in my mind than this stupid 3D maze. I just could not figure out how to get through it when I was a kid, and I have no idea why. Like, it wasn't that hard this time. I beat it in a couple of minutes, but that was not the case for younger me. The rest of the puzzles in this area are actually kind of neat, but no matter how easy I find it now, I will always hate this stupid maze for how long I had to spend on it as a child. But hey, after this you get to fight Yardovich, who I also remember walling me for a couple hours when I first played it. Yeah, I was not the best at games back then. I was pretty underleveled in my first playthrough, and even better is that my party had no healers because I refused to use Peach, so I just died and died and died until I went back and grinded for a while. And yeah, if you're wondering, it was a piece of cake this time, even with me restricting Peach's healing. It's so weird how something can be so hard as a kid, and then you get to it as an adult, and it's a piece of cake. Like, what's the deal? Regardless, Yardovich is just the next baddie in a long string of fights up to this point, most of which hailing from the Smithy Gang. These guys are the central enemy group at the heart of Super Mario RPG's plot. They were, after all, the reason why this whole adventure even started to begin with. Now, as a set of bad guys, the Smithy Gang aren't exactly the most interesting characters. Most of the time, they're just one-note bad guys that show up and are immediately dealt with without much impact. The only reason why Yardovich here even leaves an impression is all because of the build-up to the fight, because personality-wise, there's really nothing here, and he is on the better side of things. The likes of Punchinello are so forgettable that I often forget they're even in the game at all, and this guy, I don't even remember his name. I'm not looking it up right now. That's just how little they stand out. But if there's one thing that does stand out with pretty much all of the Smithy Gang members, it's their designs. All of the Smithy Gang members have weapons as the basis for their design. You could say their bodies are fleshed out by anything but flesh. Instead, their bodies are entirely mechanical in a way that makes them look really unnatural. And I think that serves the game well from a thematic standpoint. Compared to the naturalistic, homegrown structures of most areas in the Mushroom Kingdom, Smithy's artificial, mechanical dimension and creatures all stand out in stark contrast to the very same world they're trying to take over. The idea that Smithy intends to completely destroy this beautiful natural setting serves as a constant reminder of why we need to stop them. Of course, this is more of a background detail than anything, like the game doesn't really do much with this concept, but the fact that it's there makes the game's main opposing force feel just that bit more threatening, or at least as threatening as they can look in this cute art style. Like, come on. It's adorable. Yes, indeed, Super Mario RPG was notable at the time for pushing the boundary with its semi-3D graphics. Being able to do what looked like fairly close to 3D visuals on the Super Nintendo was a huge deal back then, and so games like this were praised back in the day for how good they looked. In the years since, however, I've heard a lot of people deride these pre-rendered SNES games for looking ugly and dated. That's a fair opinion to have, I guess, but I feel the same way now that I did when I first played it back in 2010. It didn't bother me, like, at all. Quite the contrary, while obviously the intention behind the visual style was to be boundary pushing, nowadays I think it gives the game its own unique visual identity. Now don't get me wrong, I love sprites too, but I think this visual style really helps Mario RPG stand out from the rest of the 16-bit generation. And beyond that, I don't know, I just think it looks kinda cool. It reminds me of some of the childhood games I had on the DS where the 3D models and 2D sprites would oftentimes be combined to get this very specific look that I just really love. Or, you know, maybe it does look bad and I'm just weird. Something that became really noticeable by the later points in Super Mario RPG is that the game doesn't really want you to be doing the same thing for too long. It always has you jumping from one event to the next, with barely any time between to stop and smell the roses, so to speak. You'll be given some story, told to go through an area, battle some enemies, and eventually fight a boss, escape the area, and be forced into a minigame, and then arrive to the next story beat, and all within half an hour. This frenetic pace that the game keeps going is absolutely why it works so well. It's hard to really ever get bored when there's always something new happening. It's kind of an interesting way to approach an RPG, and one I assume that was taken on account of the audience of RPG newcomers this game was catered towards. But all that being said, I'd really like it if we spent just a little more time hearing from these characters. Cutscenes in this game never really run on for more than a couple minutes, which keeps the pace going, sure, but it also means that we really don't get to see much of what the cast of characters has to say. I mean, this is a fun party with huge potential for some real fun interactions, but most of the time the game is too hyper-focused on keeping that frenetic pace going to really let us get any of that at all. It's kind of disappointing, especially because in the few interactions we do see, the characters work really well off each other, but nope, besides a couple notable moments, it barely ever happens, and that kinda sucks. Also, what's unfortunate is that when that frenetic pace is broken, it becomes even more noticeable than it would be otherwise. So, for example, later in the adventure, I was told I had to head to Monstro Town because there was a star there. And so, after an overworld segment that went on for far too long, I made it to Monstro Town only to find out that actually, no, that wasn't where the star was, and instead we just needed to head back to the overworld again, take a different path, and then we'll get to the next story beat. All while barely anything is happening plot-wise. And it's here where the game could have broken up an overworld section with a nice character interaction scene, but no, it can't do that, I guess. It might bore the non-RPG fans. It also doesn't help that this is the point where I finally started to get a little bit tired of the combat. Now, trust me, I was still having fun, don't get me wrong, but those timed hits had long since began to feel a little too simplistic, and the battle system never really evolves past this point. Your party stops getting new special attacks, the enemies become a little too weak to get worried by, and there's not really much customizability outside of the battle system either. Putting on equipment here is always just as simple as going to the newest shop, buying the best armor and weapons, and then just equipping them. The accessories, the one major piece of customizable equipment as well, really don't make up for it either. The game lets you choose an extra stat to upgrade with each level up, which theoretically could allow for more customizability, but that's ruined by the fact that there's always one stat upgrade that benefits you way more, and it's always the one that you didn't pick on the last two level ups. And by the way, this isn't a recent thing I realize now because I played so many other RPGs. No, I felt like this even on my first playthrough. Now thankfully, after the Monstro Town kerfuffle, the game has what is, in my opinion, its best arc, featuring a cool setup, the completion of the game's most interesting character arc, plenty of fun and hilarious moments, and most importantly, the best plot in a boss fight up to this point. But regardless, the battle system problems still stick around. And yeah, I think I'm making a bit of a bigger deal here than I normally would. I don't stop enjoying these battles, they just start to wear on me by the end of the game, and that kinda sucks. Regardless, we're basically at the end of the game here, so why don't we talk about the final chunk? So I collected 6 of the 7-star pieces, I outfitted everyone with the best gear I could find, and now it's time to take on the very location this whole adventure started at. Now as far as structure goes, this isn't exactly the most notable Bowser's Castle, but there is this one little neat section here, this room. You have 6 different doors to choose from, but you only have to complete 4 to proceed. I've always liked having this kind of choice in a final dungeon. It means I can pick and choose what I want to do, meaning I don't have to touch these horrible platforming sections. At the end, you fight Exor, though I say fight, but it really ends up just being this. This is such a cool little frickin' detail, I love it. And while the previous area was a pretty typical final area for the series, what's coming next isn't. Right from the beginning, Smithy's dimension is imposing. The visual design and music managed to create this overbearing atmosphere that's equal parts bleak and intimidating, showing just what's at stake if Smithy isn't stopped. The area breaks hard from the established style of the rest of the Mario games up to this point, which makes this final area feel much more memorable than it could have been. Oh, and I love how the past bosses are just like regular fights here. It's just a cool way of showcasing just how much stronger you've gotten. It's also a cool way of showing that the machinery Smithy's gang's bodies are made of wasn't just for show here. These guys are being manufactured. And you know, if you don't stop Smithy here, then there's gonna be an army ready to take the Mushroom Kingdom by force, and you can't really stop them. The stakes are high, and it's do or die time. Time to meet Smithy, who's not quite as exciting as I would hope. Personality-wise, Smithy suffers from the exact same problems the rest of his gang suffer from. He's portrayed as nothing more than just a bad guy, and he really doesn't have that strong of a personality or anything really notable about his character at all, and that's kind of disappointing, but it's what I expected. I didn't really think it'd change by this point. I imagine they just wanted to keep it simple here, considering this is still, you know, a Mario game. Regardless of all of that, though, it's made up for the sheer absurdity of this fight. Smithy's constantly changing heads to change his abilities, and the fight is an absolute blast, probably the hardest one in the game up to this point. But regardless of how much of a fight he puts up, Smithy is vanquished eventually, and the 7th star is returned. And with that, having accomplished his goals, Geno leaves the doll behind, taking the star pieces with him. And after this, we get a cute little wrap-up on most of the cast. Mallow taking over as rightful prince of the kingdom, Bowser and his army making repairs to his destroyed castle, Booster and Valentina, well, doing what you'd expect. It's a cute little epilogue, but one that's become a little more bittersweet with time, because for most of these characters, Super Mario RPG would be their final resting place. Not long after Super Mario RPG's release, Square and Nintendo would split hard, leaving Super Mario RPG, which once stood as a monument to the company's good relationship, now in a state of limbo. Years would pass, and as it did, Super Mario RPG's importance would be largely forgotten. On one end, while it certainly was the game that introduced many to RPGs as a whole, a mere couple years later, another game would do the very same thing, but on a much wider scale. And on the other end, while Super Mario RPG would certainly become a jumping off point for later Mario RPGs, even then its impact on them has been largely forgotten. Both of its spiritual successors have moved far beyond Super Mario RPG to establish their own unique style, and outside of a rare cameo, the games are barely even allowed to reference their spiritual predecessor. Now, the fans of Super Mario RPG have done the best job they could of raising its flag, of trying to keep the flame alive, and it's honestly rather impressive that even over 20 years later, there are still people trying to keep love for Super Mario RPG alive. But there's only so much they can do on their own. Nintendo and Square seem to have almost no interest in Super Mario RPG anymore. In fact, it almost feels like they'd rather forget about it entirely. It's barely ever mentioned, getting it re-released on new hardware always seems like it's pretty low priority, and even the one single thing fans have been begging for years continues to get ignored time and time again. And when a company refuses to care about something they helped make for so long, it only makes sense that its impact would be largely forgotten. Let me put it like this. When I was a kid, I knew plenty of people who could tell me about Partners in Time or even Paper Mario 64. And heck, I even knew people who could tell you several things about games released way before that, but not a single one of them had ever heard of Super Mario RPG, much less played it. There's a reason why I had to so desperately push my friend to play it with me, and that's because even by the time I first played it, its legacy might as well have not even existed. I'm honestly thrilled I got to experience Super Mario RPG when I did. More than just my first foray into retro games, Super Mario RPG was a game I loved, one that's world fascinated me from the moment I first found out about it, and it may very well be the reason I met what might just be one of my best friends that I've ever made. Even if I didn't get to experience it when it was new, and even if it wasn't my first Mario RPG, much less my first RPG, I still have an insane amount of love and appreciation for it. And heck, it's kind of cool I can say I grew up with it despite the fact that I'd never even heard of a Super Nintendo before playing it. I just fear that my case might become rarer and rarer as time goes on. And sure, maybe one day Mario RPG will come back and we'll get a remake or a sequel or whatever, but that still doesn't change the fact that for over 20 years, the only thing keeping this game alive was its fans. But hey, here's hoping, right? But, as I mentioned earlier, while this would be the end of Mario RPG, this would not be the end of Mario RPGs, because just a couple of years later, a game would come out that would be the start of something completely new, and more importantly, the start of a series that I hold extremely near and dear to my heart. But it's funny actually, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that the same day I bought Super Mario RPG, I still had a little left over, and so I purchased another game alongside it, one that happened to be the predecessor to what was one of my favorite games of all time. So then, why wasn't it mentioned here much? I mean, considering I played them at the same time, you'd think I would have mentioned it at least a couple times here and there. Well, I think that's a Mario story best saved for next time. For now, I guess that's game over. Analysis. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed.